Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second session for the day of LitFestx. We have with us the brilliant Anand Ranganathan, who is a author several times over. He's a columnist, writer, and a good point to note. He went to the other city, to Cambridge. I went to Oxford, so we need to sort out some stuff after this session, Anand, about that as well.
Yes.
Uh, but that's on a lighter note. Anand's recent book, which is launched in August earlier this year, um, "The Northeast of India: Separating Fact from Fiction," is a session which is titled not on the book per se, because the book, published by Bloomsbury, is ultimately a psychological love story which is set in the backdrop of the Northeast and all the troubled and checkered history of the region. Anand has done a lot of research on that area. And, Anand, tell us, very broadly, why did you choose the Northeast as the backdrop for this love story?
Right. So, Kumar, first of all, thanks very much for having me on this wonderful platform. And I think it's been a fantastic festival. To come back to your question, in fact, the story was imagined with a friend of mine, a college friend, the last 26 years, Bharat Solanki, who's also a film director. And the way we imagined this was we had a few plot points, and then because although I've been to the Northeast, I haven't stayed there for prolonged periods of time. He suggested, why not have Northeast as a backdrop? And to be honest, my knowledge of the Northeast was perhaps the knowledge that most Indians have, who are not from the Northeast. So I was a bit skeptical because a writer, even though even if the writer is a fiction writer, you want to translate the material that you have, the knowledge that you gain into fiction. And I hadn't had, so much experience from the Northeast, so I was a bit skeptical. But then I started doing research on the Northeast, and soon, what we discovered was that there was so much of the Northeast history that people in India are just simply unaware of. Not only of the geography, but of the history of the tragedies that have happened. So the more we did research, the more we realized that here is one opportunity where we can actually weave fiction, which, as you said, is a psychological love story set in the tea estates in the Northeast, with non-fiction that very few Indians are aware of. So that was the whole premise on which the book actually began.
Okay. And so did you also then have to spend a lot of time physically, trying to get a sense of the place, or was it more sort of secondary research that you did?
Yeah, it was all secondary research, in fact. But of course, we had discussions with a lot of our friends back from college who are from Mizoram and from the Northeast in general, including a few, including one, in fact, who's immediately after leaving college, he joined tea estates and has been in Kenya, in Kerala, in Assam. So it was basically the information gleaned from, primarily research, reading books on, the debacle that happened in Mizoram, the great famines leading up to the Aizawl bombing, which features prominently in the book as a backdrop, and the events that followed the Aizawl bombing, which were, even if I can put it that way, even worse than the bombing, because not many people know this, that 80% of the population of the state was actually displaced. So what you had was kind of a year zero, Cambodia-like year zero situation right here in India. And no one knows about this. No one knew about the Aizawl bombing, how it happened. In fact, right from top down, the whole news was hushed. So, the Prime Minister said there was no Aizawl bombing. The people who took part in the Aizawl bombing denied it. It was only now, some very good books written on the debates that happened in the Assam. So Mizoram was part of Assam at that point of time. So a few people, did go to Aizawl and meticulously documented the tragedy that happened in 1966. And when they came to the Assam Legislative Assembly, they said, look, this is what has happened. But of course, their cries went unheard. And as a result, we don't see, the specter of Aizawl bombing or any discussion on it in our school history books, even in, a lot of history books that have been written over the last 40 years. It's just disappeared, And that is what actually fascinated us, that how come, we keep talking about it is perhaps, in a very limited way acceptable that we don't know the history of a lot of other nations. We don't know the history of, or we don't need to know the history of, let's say, some African nations, even though of course we do. But in our own country, in our own state, when such tragedies happen and we are unaware of it. So it was primarily the research that happened, reading books on the thing and talking to friends, who are from Mizoram, who are from Assam, and who work in the tea estates. So it's a bit of an amalgam of all. Yeah.
Lovely. I mean, for a lot of us, I'm sure it's the same with you, but we stay in tier 1 cities or certain parts of the country. The Northeast is a little bit of an enigma, right? It's I wouldn't say mystical, but there's little known about it. We don't know much about the language, about the people. Only of late have there been efforts by state governments to promote it as a tourist destination as well. So what do you think is happening here? I mean, basis your research.
I think it has to do with a lot to do with the fact that we've actually never assimilated a lot of cultures. Even though our pet phrase is unity in diversity, but we've refused to acknowledge a lot of our diversity. So I mean, if you, for example, I mean, I'm prone to a lot of stereotyping and generalization, so please pardon me. But somebody said on Twitter the other day that we have South Indians who come to North India and they learn Hindi. How many North Indians go to South India and learn South Indian languages? So I mean, of course, this is without data and rank generalization, and pardon me for doing so. But I think to a very large extent, the same is true with Northeast as well. And of course, there was a lot of division of states. So, for example, during independence, were just one state. So we had Punjab, that was actually Haryana was part of Punjab, and we had Bombay, where Maharashtra and parts of Gujarat, Gujarat was part of this Bombay state. Same went with Madras. But soon they divided. Whereas in the Northeast, I mean, everything was under Assam and no one really cared, and people were fighting for their rights, and they were ignored, and there were a lot of tragedies. For example, the Motam, the famine, the great famine that happens every 48, 50 years, which is, a large population of rats, devastates the crop. And this happened in Mizoram and in the 50s and in the early 60s. And because of the fact that Mizoram was not a state, and because of local prejudices, their cries were just ignored. So Assam did not really bother about what's happening in Mizoram. And that was actually the birth of the Mizo National Front, birth of a lot of insurgency that happened. So everything is tied up to our ignorance of local issues that then we ignore for such a long time, and then when it actually just bursts out, then we kind of try to contain the situation, and tragedies happen, like the Aizawl bombing and the Year Zero kind of situation, village trooping. So
right. Coming to the book specifically, you developed some very interesting characters. Ipsita, Shrimmer. I mean, tell us a little bit about the construct or the background of these characters, and how you sort of went about it, keeping in mind the backdrop of the Northeast.
Right. So Shimmer, in fact, is Shimmer, and in fact, there's the other person, Akhil Mehra. They are from the army, and in fact, whatever's been written about them in the book, is again, many of the characters that occur in the book are actually our friends. So, so for example, Akhil Mehra is in reality a person who's a paratrooper, who's been to Siachen and who's been our college friend. So, we learned a lot about paratrooping, if I can call it that. But at the heart was this, this wonderful instance where you would try and drop someone who reads into a very claustrophobic environment. And believe it or not, Kumar, the thing with tea estates is they're wonderful places to visit, they're wonderful places to have a vacation. But if you are to stay in one, it can get very claustrophobic. And I've done that once, and of course I know a friend of mine who spent his entire life in the tea estates. So the idea was, what does one do in a tea estate? What happens is slowly one begins to cocoon oneself in one's own thoughts. One starts to read a lot, and what one reads, the characters that are there in the book, one slowly starts to take their personality. So this was a very interesting aspect of the book. So even though the background is continuously about the Northeast and the troubles in the Northeast, but I'm a bit of a fan of a book of manners. The kind of books that used to be written 100 years ago or 70, 80 years ago. Elizabeth Bowen, and very polite but very conversational. And you try and not until you've read 7 or 8 pages do you realize what is actually happening, and you kind of delve into it. You kind of dive into it, but it's a very smooth kind of dive. It's not very sudden. So nothing happens for a long time, and then something suddenly erupts. So here is an environment which is a tea estate, and here suddenly you have people who are terribly lonely, who just have delved into books for most of their lives. And here comes a dashing army officer, and what happens? And that was very interesting to find out what happens. And I mean, of course, one knows what would happen is that in an environment, very claustrophobic environment, you would latch on to this person, not let it go. And when you have two people of a similar age, latching on to someone, I mean, what's going to happen. And as it happens, these two people were Ipshita and Indrani, who were both sisters. So we thought of exploring this. So let me call these passages as violent book of manners. So this is what transpired in the tea estate.
So I think it's your book launched in August, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes. Yes.
And one of the characters whose name you just took has been in the news in the last few months, of course, for dubious reasons, again from the Northeast. Is that a very common name there, or you just thought about it?
Norden, you mean Norden?
No, Indrani.
Oh, okay. No, actually, I mean, if I wasn't a South Indian, I would be a Bengali. I love Bengalis. I love Bengal. I love the literature. I love the the culture. I mean, there's half my genes probably epigenetically are probably Bengali. So, and we decided on the name so much before this incident happened with this Indrani. And of course, all Bengalis usually have their household nickname as well. So Indrani is called Pihu, and Ipshita is called Mishti. And I really like this. So it's nothing to do with this Indrani. Let me clarify.
Yeah. Although it wouldn't be a bad way to link things. Both are from the Northeast with a similar name, and yes. Both characters certainly have seen a lot of adventurous environments in the recent past. Certainly,
yes.
Coming to the setting of the tea plantations in the book. Clearly, India is a nation of tea drinkers primarily, and very little is known about life in a tea estate, let's say, right? Or how it gets done. I mean, apart from the mechanics around it, but I'm sure it is a very labor-intensive process.
Yes.
It's ultimately agriculture. And so, did you find a lot of unique ideas or unique threads which then you have woven in your book?
We did actually, again, primarily from the research that we did, and significantly from a friend, college friend who is managing tea estates. So it's, I mean, I talked about the claustrophobia of a tea estate, which is immediately evident, if you spend more than a couple of months there. But more than that, there is this subterranean flow in a tea estate, and there is incredible amount of class discrimination. There is a hierarchy. There is almost a kind of a feudal setup, which has kind of lasted, over generations, if I may say so. So, we have, as my friend was saying, we have generations of tea estate workers, last 4 generations who've been working on the tea estate, living on a pittance, but they don't know life outside it. And of course, we have the tea estate owners who are also, of course, now there are private companies who have acquired them, but, for a very long time, this was a kind of a domain which was almost, you can say, zamindar, so, and even now, in fact, there is one tea estate owner who prances around his tea estate on a horse wearing a sun topi, I forget the name. So they are not very pleasant places, which is very unfortunate, very unfortunate. In fact, if you remember, Kumar, about a month ago, BBC did an extensive reportage on the Indian tea estates, and what they found were horrendous conditions. They were actually unfit to live for the laborers there, and they paid a pittance. There is hardly any medical care, and every couple of months or so, a revolt happens where managers are brutally lynched or killed by the tea estate workers because they just can't take it anymore. So it's a very strange mix of a lot of things that are not immediately apparent to the rest of India. But of course, as you began with your first sentence, we love to drink tea. We don't really care about where it comes from, and I really hope the government focuses on this area, because if for something as important as tea, we must know how it is being produced. We must know how the tremendous rights, a tremendous violation of the human rights of the people, tea estate workers, is happening right here in India. And of course, when you say Indians love to drink tea, can I just add, being a South Indian, they love to drink coffee as well.
Of course, of course. Certainly. I forgot about the fact that you are South Indian. So I got corrected several times. So every time I would meet somebody from down south, I would say South Indian, and he would say, no, well, it's not just South India. I'm Tamil. I'd say, okay, I'm sorry. Then sometimes I'm, well, I'm a Karnataka. I'd said, okay, I'm sorry again. So on this note, when you're talking about, one part of the set is around tea estates, and of course, then you're talking about people having lived in, high levels of insurgency and unrest, in terms of civil wars, etc., over, protracted periods of time.
Yes.
How do you see these two aspects coming together in your book? Are they playing a very, very strong role in the way the characters then shaped up, in the way they interact, or probably in the love story sort of part of it? Give us some insights into it.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Not so much in the love story, Kumar, but in the background. So, for example, you have this character who's been a victim of Aizol bombing, and he's come to the Half-Long Tea Estate. Norden is his name. And you get glimpses of Northeastern history through his eyes. So he's almost as a mute spectator to what is happening in the tea estate. But every time he says something or he does something, you immediately can relate to his trauma and his tragedy that happened. And let me also say this, that they're quite inscrutable in the sense, I mean, Norden is, because we have this thing that if you in India rather, that if you don't say anything, that means you don't understand anything, which is completely wrong. The people who are silent, who people who are silent doesn't mean that they don't understand anything or they don't know anything. And there is a tremendous amount of forgiveness, if I can say so, not quite forgetting, but at least forgiveness that has transpired into the lives of people from the Northeast. So let me give you an example. The Aizawl bombing happened in 1966, and the Mizo people signed the Mizo Accord in 1986. And now Mizoram is considered to be one of the most peaceful states in India, which is absolutely right. But the first paragraph of the Mizo Accord, which was signed between Lal Denga and Mr. Lal Denga and Rajiv Gandhi in 1986, the first paragraph thanks the person who bombed Aizawl, Indira Gandhi. So this is a fascinating contrast of what we remember and what we're willing to forgive and what we're willing to forget. So what I would say is that the Mizo people are incredibly kind people. They are willing to forgive. What we are doing, the rest of India, we are willing to forget, but we must never forget. The tragedies that have happened, because they're important. And I just wish that, of course, not the love story, but the background gets into our school textbooks, because this is one way to educate the rest of India. As you said initially, that why is it that the Northeast kind of is doesn't come into the main discourse as often. And incidentally, the book was launched by Karma Paljor and Madhu Trehan, and a couple of weeks ago. And Karma was asked this question, that this so-called tyranny of distance that one person talked about, that events from the Northeast don't garner that much media attention because of the distances involved. And Karma has been doing a spectacular job. So he's from Sikkim, and he's now in mainstream journalism. He's an anchor in CNN, IBN. And if you talk to him, he says, I make great efforts to convince my colleagues to cover the Northeast. And if we have more people like Karma, and we have more stations there, more news gathering sources in the Northeast, maybe things would change in a couple of decades, or at least a decade. I really wish so.
Yes, we certainly do so.
Yeah.
I think it's time now to take maybe a question or two from the online audience who've been tweeting about the session.
Right.
I'm just scrolling through. Okay, so here's a question from Ramana Krishna. His question is to you, Anand, and it says, do you think writers have a moral or social responsibility to talk about social evils in their writing?
That's a very interesting question. I don't know about moral responsibility. I think whatever comes from within, can be construed as moral responsibility or a responsibility in the first place. But what I would like to say is that one should write for one's own pleasure. That is what. So if you think that what is happening around you is wrong, if you think so, then write about it. But if you think what is happening around you is not wrong, and still you depict it as wrong, or the other way around, then of course a lot of people do that. There's nothing wrong in that. What you're doing is you're chronicling what is happening. But when you talk of moral and when you talk of responsibilities, I think the primary job of the writer is to be fearless. It does not matter, what you write, on where you write. If you are fearless about it, then your honesty will come through. I mean, as someone said, the birth of the reader, but is the death of the author. I can't remember who said it, but I think that phrase has struck in my mind, that always write for your own pleasure, always do things for your own pleasure. It's always
interesting. There's another question we can take. It says, take us through the most loved moment or event that you enjoyed writing this book.
Okay. In fact, they were, if I can say, they were events, not events, because the way the whole story was imagined was that it was, as I said, it was written, or it was imagined with a college friend of mine, Bharat Solanki, who's a film director. And then when we started imagining the whole story, my wife, Sheetal, and my brother-in-law came along as well. So every weekend, we would hunt the restaurants in Delhi and we sit and, we discuss how to take the story further. So these were the events that were hugely enjoyable. And of course, it took, a year for me to write the book. So there are too many things that follow. In fact, the beauty of writing is in imagining it. I mean, once you have that spark and you've put it on paper, it's time to move on. And I think it's the same with books as well. Once you've written a book, you spend so much effort in writing it, but then you can't continuously brood over it. I mean, there's always the next mountain to climb. There's always the next book to write. There's always the next experiment to do, and there is always the next election to win. So it's true for every field. If you the journey has to be enjoyable, but if there's always the next one around the corner, hopefully.
Sure. And since you've mentioned your friend, the film director, several times in this conversation, I'm tempted to ask you: is there a movie in the offing about the book?
Well, hopefully, I mean, all we need is a kind financier. So we have the script ready and the budget and everything. We just wait, and the actors, the list and everything. We're just waiting for someone to come along and say, "Hey, I really love the story, and I would like to, I would like to produce it, and I would like to see it on the big canvas." I think that would be wonderful.
So, God willing, I'm sure you will find someone or maybe a group of people to make that happen. It was lovely talking to you, Anand, and thank you for your very candid responses to questions from the online audience as well.
It was a pleasure.
We wish your book a lot of success, and riding on that success, we also hope to see a movie on it.
Wonderful.
And then we'll do another chat about the process of that film.
Let's hope so. Fingers crossed.
Great. Thank you so much, Anand.
Thank you. Thank you.